Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be presenting on the research we've been working on to improve question answering on financial-based documents. All right. So overview of how the presentation is going to go. Just an overview of what RAG is and why we need it, and then the problem for our specific use case. And then we're kind of go into why RAG currently has a lot of limitations, and then the different strategies we're trying to make it better, and the different ways we're going to try to evaluate of how good our RAG systems are so that we can basically tell whether or not we made improvements. Oh, shit. So for us to what RAG is, it's basically a way of knowledge injection for large language models. So LLMs are limited by their training data, usually. So if you want to ask it information on things that are like more recent or not in their training data, they won't know it, and that can lead to like things like hallucinations. And the two main ways to kind of add additional knowledge to large language models is with like fine tuning or like in context learning, and RAG is a form of in context learning, where in this method we're not actually changing the model parameters with additional training like we would be in fine tuning. We're just kind of adding additional information into the query itself or to the input of the LLM so that it'll have like this additional knowledge to refer to. And the way that it adds this additional knowledge is through this thing called a knowledge hub, which is made up of like knowledge sources. And this kind of diagram explains how that happens, where the user will ask a question, and that question is converted to embeddings, which are numerical representations of the text. And we do a similarity search through the vector database. And this vector database basically just has all the information of the additional knowledge you want to add to it. So if you want to chat with financial documents, the vector database has embeddings of all that information. And based on the similarity search, it'll retrieve the top K chunks, and then that will kind of be the context where it'll feed in directly to that large language model. So it'll be like, I have this question, answer this question using the following context. The context will be from the knowledge sources, and then the LLM will have all the information it needs right there in order to answer the question accurately. And because the information is put right there, it's very effective in preventing hallucinations because it'll have access to the information, so it won't have to make up additional things. However, kind of like the basic way of it works, while it's good and effective for like maybe simple use cases, as you want to get more complex, there's a lot of like limitations. And one is basically that RAG kind of assumes that the most similar section of the document is the most relevant, because it does a similarity search based on something like cosine similarity, which is kind of seeing if there's the most similar words or phrases. However, that's not necessarily the section in the document you would look to if, say, you were a human doing this sort of question answering. So traditional RAG pipelines kind of makes that false assumption. And additionally, a lot of basic RAG pipelines chunk the document into uniform sections. So they'll choose a chunk of, for example, like 1,000 characters, and each chunk that it converts to in the embedding will have that same amount of characters, and every piece of context that it returns to the large language model will be the same size. But this kind of has a lot of issues with it, where maybe you'll cut off, the context will cut really awkwardly in the middle of the sentence, or maybe if you make the chunk too big, it'll just contain a lot of like really irrelevant information. And you're also completely disregarding things, other things in the document, such as if it has like tables or graphs. Maybe like traditional pipelines won't be able to kind of account for all of that. And additionally, for more advanced question answering, like especially for like financial data, maybe it's located in like different, maybe it's located in different locations, and it's not just based on similarity. So with sparse information, where you kind of need like specific sections from a lot of different places. The regular k nearest neighbor search doesn't work very well. And also these embedding algorithms are generally pretty like standard, and they lack very like domain specific knowledge. So a phrase in like regular English can mean something different in like a finance or like a legal specific domain. And because we're just doing an embedding search and it's based off of like that embedding algorithm, it can kind of like lose those nuances. So it's kind of an overview of like maybe for maybe like a basic pipeline why traditional RAG would work, but as you get like more complex, as you want to chat with multiple documents, and like the actual content of these documents is like more higher level, these are a lot of like the limitations that we run into. And now sort of going into ways we can actually make RAG better. So as I talked about before, uniform chunking is what, a lot of what we kind of start out with, where we just decide on a chunk size and we're like, every chunk is this size, but it disregards a lot of things about the document. And there's different strategies and like techniques to like improve it, because chunking should really be like dynamic, and we should consider it with processing like the document. So instead of just like scraping the raw text of something like a PDF and then like making it equal sizes, we should improve it by doing things like better like data pre-processing, where we clean and acknowledge like things like white space or different structures, and actually are able to recognize, hey, this is a graph or this is a table, and maybe make that a separate chunk instead of just however it's originally scaped. And it should also kind of keep in mind of like the sentence structure, because you don't want to be breaking up chunks like mid sentence, because it can have like incomplete information. So recursive chunking kind of uses other like it uses like other libraries and like natural language processing techniques to sort of like more dynamically divide the text, so that it's like at the end of like a paragraph or like a set or a sentence, and it's not so harsh of like this many characters. It's done. And element-based chunking is that we can kind of use it in addition to recursive chunking, where maybe we can define things as like if there's a heading, that's kind of like indication we should start a new chunk because it's a separate section. And same thing with subheadings. And then we also acknowledge different elements like tables and graphs in the document, and like make those their separate chunks. And I'll go into this later, but we can also annotate that data so that it'll also help like our retrieval strategy. But the things of like data pre-processing, the way we chunk it, and the way we like index and annotate, um the chunks have like a really big impact on how the RAG system actually works. And this kind of goes into like metadata annotations. So in regular RAG, we kind of just like break up these chunks, and then we don't have any additional information for it. All the information is just whatever's in that chunk, and we kind of just throw it all together in like maybe like one big vector database. But there's information that about the document or about the nature of that like content that we're missing out on, because it's not explicitly in like the raw text. And this really comes into play when we want to chat across like multiple different documents. So for example, in a financial sense, if we have like financial reports for several different companies, or maybe of like financial reports over like several different years, things like the company name or the date it's from might not be explicitly stated in the text, but that sort of thing could be important when answering the question, which is why we can, in each like embedding or like vector, when it's stored in the database, we can add additional information such as like it is from this company and it is from this date. So if the question is asking like what is like this metric from like 2018, it'll be able to um know things like that. And we can also kind of give it like additional like information. So previous research kind of annotated chunks with things like a summary of the chunk, or like kind of like representative keywords of what that chunk is about, so that it's not just, we're not just treating like everything as like as the same thing. And with specific to finance, if it would it would also be beneficial to like annotate it with information of like with the elements like graphs and tables, to annotate it with the additional information like, oh, like this is a cash flow statement, or this is like an income statement. So when we ask like specific like uh metrics, it could also have more like direction when searching in the vector database of like where and how that information is stored. And another method that we could use is query expansion, which is basically a way to like add further directions to know what chunk to receive. So how like in traditional how RAG works is the algorithm really only has the user's question to base its search off of. So the user will ask a question and it'll just do a similarity search of the question and the entire like document base. But maybe there's like additional information besides the question um that something like a cosine similarity won't capture, especially if like the question seems like relatively like simple, like it's asking like a certain like accounting term or metric, but you need like additional information of like phrases and terms that are not included in the question in order to answer that question properly. And we use something like query expansion or transformations. Hypothetical document embeddings is um a proposed method of doing this, whereas regularly we just use a question to search the documents. In this method, we first just ask the LLM to answer the question without like doing any retrieval of any sort. So it'll give like a hypothetical answer. And this is kind of taken as an additional document. And maybe you take the question and the hypothetical answer and then use those to search results in the document. And the idea behind this is that the hypothetical answer will kind of give like additional clues or phrases or terms that will guide the algorithm to search in more like specific and like better locations rather than just the document itself. And then another one is re-ranking algorithms. This kind of goes to address the shortcoming that regular RAG assumes that similarity corresponds to relevance, specifically like cosine similarity. So in regular RAG, you'll kind of get like the top K chunks, and that's just based off like what is most similar, so what has the most similar words and phrases, but maybe that's like not necessarily the best chunks to answer the questions. So you can use like a separate re-ranking algorithm, maybe one that also uses some NLP or like machine learning techniques of its own uh that accounts for like the question and the chunk, and then it can re-rank it can generate a score on its own and be like, okay, given this question, how good is this context to answer this question, and then it'll assign a score based on that, which is like kind of like a relevant score. So if the context is like has all the needed information to answer the question, it'll get like a high relevance score. But that context is not always the one that's ranked highest in terms of similarity, which is why we can do things like re-ranking the chunks, and then after the re-ranking, we maybe put in the top K chunks into the input query. So basically we ideally would have the most relevant rather than just the most similar chunks being fed into the large language model. Those are kind of like the ways to maybe like different techniques we can try out to address the shortcomings of RAG, but also to kind of evaluate its robustness. It's also a bit complex and nuanced, just as because it goes beyond a step of just regular like question answering, which in itself is a difficult task. But with RAG, we not only need to evaluate how good is is our algorithm in answering the questions, but we also need to evaluate how good is it able to like search through the documents and retrieve the relevant and the correct context. Because even if you have like a really good ability to like answer questions, if your model is not given the correct chunk to begin with, it even if it's like a good model, if it's not given the right context, it can't answer the question properly. So it's really good and important to evaluate and measure both of these things. So for retrieval, we can kind of do like accuracy if we have access to the um ground truth of like this is the section in the document a human analyst would like find the answer. That would be ground truth, and then we compare that to like where did our retrieval algorithm look in the document to find the answer, and then like evaluate and then like compare both of that as kind of like just like straight up like accuracy. But also, if we don't usually, in most like actual like use cases, we don't necessarily like have access to like that ground truth. So for more like in unstructured data, there is a framework called RAGAS, which has like a couple different things to evaluate the retrieval accuracy. One thing is called like context relevance, and it basically you input the question and then the context that your algorithm retrieve to like answer that question, and then it basically counts through using another large language model. It counts like how many sentences in the context are actually relevant in answering the question, and that kind of ratio of like the actual relevant sentences versus like the total number of sentences is basically measuring like how good is the retrieve context, because you don't want it to just retrieve like you know the super huge chunk that only has like a little bit of relevant information and the all is just kind of irrelevant. And then for actual like question answering, it's kind of like we can also use um large language evaluation, where we use another LLM with a specific prompt of like, you know, this is the ground truth answer, and then this is the model answer. Can you like tell me whether or not it's correct or wrong, or assigning a score for it? But obviously, while that it's not like as like reliable and robust as like a human eval, but it does lead like more insights than maybe something just like a cosine similarity or rogue score that kind of also has like shortcomings of its own, where it can misclassify as like it can like a technically correct answer can have like a low score, whereas like LLM eval can like capture that nuance more. And then with ragas, there's also other metrics that kind of take both into account, where it's like something like faithfulness or like a hallucination score, which shows that how much is the model answer grounded in the context. So it's basically kind of measuring whether or not the model like hallucinated like new information or not, or basically everything that was in the answer was supported by the context or not. So each of these alone kind of are insufficient of getting like a comprehensive picture, just because of like the complexity of these tasks. But by kind of like looking at each different metric through like a different lens, we can get a somewhat holistic overview of like how like the model is performing, and then also through that kind of tell like which techniques may are good at improving the model and which ones are not. Yeah, I think that kind of concludes the presentation of an overview of the RAG research we've been doing. Thank you for listening.